Hi, everyone. This is Tim Mills. I'm the host of the Harmonic Atheist channel. And I just wanted to give a little preface to this video that I am interviewing a theist today, Philip Yancey. He's a best-selling Christian author. So if you're coming looking for a deconversion story, this is an interesting story, but this is not it. If it does trigger you to hear Christians talking in Christian language and with Christian worldview assumptions, please come back for another interview later. But I encourage you to at least consider it. It is short, it is fascinating, and there's also, I give a little bit of a afterword after the video to explain where I'm coming from and some reflections on our short time with Philip Yancey. But I just want to give at least that disclaimer. Feel free to watch if you'd like. If not, I totally understand. And here's the interview. Today I'm speaking with Philip Yancey. Philip, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, I'm glad to be here, Tim.
I really appreciate you doing this. And you had to get up early to meet this schedule. So you're over there in Colorado, is that right?
That's right. And I do tend to get up early anyway. A lot of writers do that. I don't know why, but we tend to be introverts and we tend to be early risers.
That's awesome. Well, I used to be an early riser, but we've got 4 little kids, and between all the energy it takes to take care of them at night, I've been sleeping in a little bit more when I can.
I can, but, sure.
Speaking of writing, I did want to make sure I gave a plug for this. This is Philip's latest book, Where the Light Fell. It is his autobiography. And so that's what we're going to be talking about briefly here at the beginning. Then we'll get into some other topics, but want to make sure I brought that up. And how's your book been going so far? Have you been seeing a lot of excitement over it?
Yeah, I've gotten a lot of responses. And one thing I learned about memoirs, Tim, all of my books before this were kind of idea-driven books. This is different. It's a story-driven book. It's just a straight narrative. And I had to chop out anytime I slipped into commentary or reflection, as much as possible. And I learned when I studied other people's memoirs that the real key to a memoir isn't so much what you learn about the writer, it's what you learn about yourself as a reader. Because when I read several hundred memoirs, just trying to figure out what is the secret, what works, what doesn't work. And in every one of them, whether they're great or whether they were terrible, in every one of them, a memory would be sparked that I wouldn't have gotten apart from reading that book. And as you read somebody else's story, subconsciously, your own story kind of keeps bouncing off against it and you learn things about yourself. So one thing that's encouraged me is that most of the responses I get are about other people's stories, reflecting back. No story is the same as mine, obviously. No story is the same as anybody else's. But I can trigger a response in the reader that gets them to face themselves. And that's very fulfilling. That's what a writer wants to do.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And just to mention too, for the bigger picture of your bio, you are a best-selling author. For anyone that doesn't know you, I think most people probably already do, but a best-selling author of Christian books. And is it correct that this is your 25th book?
Yeah, roughly. Some books I wrote with other people, it's hard to know whether to count them or count half of a book or whatever, but roughly, yeah, 2 dozen.
Gotcha.
Sounds good.
And you have done way more than I could probably give in a quick bio. For the sake of time, I'll just mention you've traveled all over the world. You speak all over. You also been an interviewer. You've interviewed presidents. Billy Graham, I believe, called you his favorite author, and other people as well. You've done an awful lot, probably more than most people could ever dream of doing. What's been your favorite kind of capstone memory of all that?
Right. We've been to 85 countries and lots and lots of memories. I was in Mumbai the night of the bombings of the Taj Mahal Hotel. I was supposed to be staying downtown. So, we've had some close calls like that where there are terrorist attacks in Egypt right after we were there. And then there have been some just delightful experiences of nature. New Zealand comes to mind. Incredible country with very few people and a lot of sheep. And
did you see any
South
hobbits?
Africa, saw no hobbits, but I did see where they filmed it. And South Africa, shortly after the change over there, then especially right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I traveled with my college roommate who's German, And it was remarkable to see the difference between the West and the East, and those first tentative explorations toward freedom from people who really had been beaten down for a long time.
Hmm.
So yeah, for a journalist, I've had just a charmed career because I've sometimes by planning, but more often by just happenstance, ended up in places where history was being made.
Hmm. That's awesome. And on a personal note, you've been married for over 50 years. Congratulations on that. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Do you
Thank
all have any
you.
children?
We do not.
Okay,
No,
gotcha.
just the two
And
of us.
and in terms of anything personal for your bio, is there anything else you'd add? Are you do you have any hobbies you're kind of dusting off at this point besides writing?
Well, when we moved to Colorado, we lived in Chicago for roughly 20 years, right downtown. And that was a great time of our lives to explore Chicago. We went to every new restaurant, every new theater, play, every new art movie, all that kind of stuff, which that's the kind of thing you should be doing in your 40s. And we did it in our 40s. But before we got too old, we came out here to Colorado, and there the emphasis turned from culture to nature. We're surrounded by animals, counted as many as 20 different species of mammals just walking through our yard. So we've got mountain lions and bears and a lot of elk and deer and all sorts of animals. And then we started climbing the mountains in Colorado and doing a lot of hiking, which really came in handy during the pandemic when things were shut down, because there's some wide open spaces out in the West, and we just took off and explored those spaces, which you could do. Social distancing is no problem when you're up here in the mountains.
Mhm. That's awesome. Yeah, I've traveled a little bit through Boulder. I have some family out there, and it's a beautiful part of the country for sure.
Right.
Well, just to give you a context for myself, I know you don't know me yet, and for anyone that doesn't know my story and my channel, my name again is Tim Mills, and I grew up in a Christian home, and I was a Christian for 43 years. I'm now 45. I went to Bob Jones University, as well as Lancaster Bible College, as well as New Tribes Mission, now called Ethnos 360. And my goal was to be a Bible translator in a jungle tribal environment. And again, at 43, I did deconvert. About 18 months earlier, I had had some reasons to do a very in-depth examination of where the Bible, specifically the New Testament, came from and the origins of Christianity and Second Temple Judaism. And after 18 months at this very computer, about 2 years ago exactly, October of 2019, I sat here and said to myself, this isn't real, is it? This has never been real. And within an hour, I was fully deconverted. And so that's been my story. 2 years from there, here I am. I've been interviewing mostly people who are in the same boat who have deconverted. But one of my goals is, of course, to understand, where people are coming from, where people are at with their deconversions. And I would say, obviously, you're not deconverted, but you would use a word that we also use, which is called deconstruction. And I kind of wanted to ask you if you could to start there, to tell us maybe a little bit of your background, and then maybe to include some of the things that over the years you kind of grew up thinking this was the way it was and this was the truth, and then it kind of slowly began to dawn on you that there was a bigger picture, and anything else you want to share in there in terms of your background.
Sure. Yeah, I know Bob Jones in Lancaster, and we came from similar soil in a lot of ways. Although I don't know where you grew up, but I had Southern fundamentalism at the core.
I was right outside of the Philadelphia airport all my childhood, and then moved to Atlanta about 10 years ago.
Right. So when I talk about Southwest 67th Street down in Philly, you know what I'm talking about in the memoir. That's where my grandmother came from.
Yep.
Yeah, I was completely religion saturated as a child. My mother was a Bible club teacher. She was really scrambling just to keep life going. She was a widow, unprepared for life. She and her husband, my father, were planning to be missionaries in Africa and had several thousand people praying for them and willing to support them. And then they ran into a pandemic. It was a different pandemic back then, the pandemic of polio, which was affecting 50, 70,000 people a year, mostly children, which made it particularly tragic. But in my father's case, he was 23 years old, prime of life, had gotten out of the Navy, had some training and wanted to be a missionary. That was his life dream.
Mm.
And then he was completely paralyzed by this disease, was in an iron lung at Grady Memorial Hospital, Charity Hospital in Atlanta. And he was so paralyzed he couldn't even breathe on his own. That's what the machine was for. It forced pressure in and out of this giant metal canister he lay in. And was pretty miserable there for about 2 months, didn't get the best treatment in the understaffed hospital like that. And a group of people around him believed that he would be healed. Why would God, quote, take a person with such prospects? So they prayed and took a leap of faith and removed him from the iron lung and took him out of that hospital to a much smaller clinic. And it appeared that there was some progress. I didn't know that for about 18 years. Of course, I knew my father died. I was only 13 months old, just a year old when he died. And only later did I find out about the faith healing aspect. That was the family secret that was kept from us two boys. And when we found that out, we understood our mother at a different degree. She had participated in this decision. I'm sure she felt guilt, probably betrayal, angry, disappointment with God. But in her theology, you can't be disappointed with God. You can't be angry at God. She should read the Bible. But anyway, so she instead offered her sons, my brother and me, as an offering to God. There's a story in the Bible about Hannah and Samuel you probably heard growing up, where Hannah was infertile and prayed, if you just give me a son, then I'll give him back to you in the temple. And that's what my mother did. And so she had this whole script laid out for my brother and me. And that went okay when we were young, but when we became teenagers, we're boys, and you individuate. That's what you do. And as we started doing that, she really went off the rails in a lot of ways. And that solemn vow became, for my brother especially, it became a kind of curse that he lived with.
A lot of pressure.
And that's the underlying plot. And because she was scrambling, we moved every year, because often bait and switch, they'll rent a house a little more cheaply for the first year and then raise the rent. But we would find another house for the first year and another house for the first year. So I went to 5 elementary schools in 6 years, always had to have a whole new set of friends. I skipped a grade, so I was younger, was bullied by people. And went to high school. There we lived in a little trailer, only 8 feet wide, 48 feet long, on the church property, this fundamentalist, fiery, hellfire and brimstone church. Could never get away from religion. So I'd been saturated through her Bible clubs. And now I'm on church property. Every time the doors open, I got to be there. A revival tent was put up every year with these people from places like Bob Jones, Tennessee Temple, places like that come and preach at us, tell us how terrible we were and how we needed to accept Jesus as our Savior, which I did many, many times. And then it started to crumble. It really started to crumble over the issue of race, because this was a racist church. Race was big in the news in the 60s. Atlanta was in many ways the center of the civil rights movement. A lot of the leaders, John Lewis, Martin Luther King, came from there. And the church basically taught this evil curse of Ham theory, that God cursed people of color, cursed the black race particularly, and they would never amount to anything. They would be servants in the tents of Shem. But they could never be a CEO. Well, I won a fellowship as a young scientist to the Center for Disease Control, then called Communicable Disease Center. And when I went in my first day, I wanted to impress my new boss. I knew he's from an Ivy League school. He's a PhD in biochemistry, very renowned. And I opened the door, and it was a black man. It was an African American. And alarm bells went off. I realized my church had lied to me about race. And if they lied to me about race, maybe they lied to me about Jesus and the Bible. So you mentioned deconstruction. And for the next several years, I just kind of suspended faith, didn't know what to believe, didn't know who to trust. Went through a period of mostly trying to psychologically survive that environment. You know the pressures of that environment from your own background,
Yeah.
and terrible pressures at home, and ended up in a Bible college where I was kind of the campus renegade, apostate. Enjoyed that role, and gradually softened, had a dramatic conversion experience that I wasn't really seeking and didn't particularly want at the time, but it changed everything for me. So
you would not have said you were saved before then, is that correct? Most likely.
I think only God knows that.
Mm-hmm.
In that environment, it's one of the themes in my book and in my life is, how do you tell the fake from the real? And if you've gone forward to receive Jesus and prayed the sinner's prayer 20 times, did one of them count? Did none of them count? Or is that whole thing kind of wispy? Who knows?
Yeah, when I interview people who tell their stories, pretty much all people who've deconverted from Christianity, but that's a very common theme, people, and myself included, where you feel like there's so much at stake, where if this is literally an issue of heaven or hell, you better be sure that you're right. And the Bible talks about that, your heart is deceitful. You can certainly be self-deceived. And so there's too much at stake to not do it a second time if you have any doubts.
Right, exactly. So things changed from there. I have an older brother who went a different path. So there were just the three of us, my mother, a widow, my brother, 2 years older, and me. And I became a writer for a Christian youth magazine, and gradually over the years started shining the spotlight on my own faith, just trying to figure it out, and revisiting themes from my childhood, but in a different way. For instance, I wrote a book called The Jesus I Never Knew, because what I came to know about Jesus is so radically different from what I was taught in that kind of Sunday school, Mr. Rogers type environment. And what's so amazing about grace, because we use that word in the church I grew up in, but I never encountered grace. I never experienced grace. So it has been a reconstruction, I suppose, of faith, deconstructing it, holding it all in suspension, and then in my books, kind of theme by theme, going back and reclaiming territory. What should I keep? What should I discard? My brother took another route. He wanted to get away as far as possible. So he made a lot of choices, some of which were self-destructive. He dropped out of a conservatory of music with 1 semester left. And instead of being a concert pianist, which he had the talent to be, he became a piano tuner, playing the same note over and over. Took a lot of LSD in the 1960s, one of Atlanta's first hippies back in the 1960s, and then ended up in California, struggled with numerous addictions, particularly to sex and some drugs and alcohol as well. And then about 10 years ago, I had a stroke. So he's disabled now, and is much calmer and more settled now than he has been at any point in life. But I saw his response to our upbringing, which was to defy it, to be as opposite as you could be. And I understand that, and was with him in that period. But the choices he made tended to be self-destructive in a lot of ways.
And one of the themes that I read as I was going through your book the last couple of weeks, your mom really played a big part in this, both in the sense of where you started from, kind of giving you this life goal to be a missionary, to make up for your father's early passing, and then through it, though, she was both certainly a spiritual leader to you in the sense of taking you to church and doing all these Bible clubs and so forth, but she was also very harsh. It was the word that came to mind for me. It's just her Christianity was very harsh. Is that fair to say?
Oh yeah. And when I look back at what my church got wrong, as I now view it, the worst thing that got wrong was the misrepresentation of God. That image of God as this bully, really a cosmic bully, just waiting to smack somebody who might be enjoying themselves or having a good time. Because most things that other people thought were fun activities were verboten in my church, even bowling, roller skating, these things, because roller skating, oh, that looks too much like dancing. Bowling, well, they probably serve beer there. So we couldn't go to movies. I tell the story of one of my classes. They went to the new movie Othello, but I couldn't go. It doesn't matter that it's Shakespeare. It's Hollywood.
Hmm.
And just that killjoy, angry, punishing image of God, which is very different than what I came to know, which is a God of grace and mercy and love and forgiveness. And there was a lot of fear and a lot of shame. I'm sure you encountered that in some of your background too. It's a control place, and it was helpful for me when I was in the Bible college. I got an assignment. Irving Goffman wrote a book called Asylums, and he tracked these controlled environment schools and insane asylums and things like that, and analyzed what they used for those control mechanisms to work. And it helped me to realize that West Point and the Air Force Academy is that they were actually stricter in those days than my Bible college, because it was a control issue. It wasn't a moral issue for them. It was a control thing. So, you would get demerits if you didn't make your bed or shine your shoes in the right way. And you had to sit on the edge of your seat, and you couldn't even speak to a person of the opposite sex back then. It's changed now.
Sounds like Bob Jones.
It sounds like Bob Jones with the dating couches, right? And it was helpful for me to separate out the kernel of truth that they were so fiercely trying to preserve and guard from the control mechanisms that really had no biblical basis or moral basis. They were just kind of the sociological way to control people.
With all that background, you mentioned you felt lied to at times, realizing there was a different picture than what you've been taught, and that some parts of it were radically different than what you've been taught. Did you ever entertain the idea that maybe the whole thing wasn't real? Did that ever cross your mind?
Well, I tell the story of this conversion experience I had. And, I admit, when I tell that story, conversion only makes sense from the inside out. Somebody else says, well, I never had that experience. Well, you're right. And I don't know what to say, except that it happened to me. It changed me. My life was different, radically different from that moment forward. It felt like something from outside that happened to me, not something that I concocted on my own. I was fiercely resistant to that kind of emotional pressure because of my upbringing. But I have to be honest about the effect on me. It was a life-changing in every way experience.
Yeah, I would have said the same thing to me to as well for my story. I wasn't. It wasn't later in life. I gave my life to Christ as a 5-year-old, and by 8 years old, I was reading stories about Hudson Taylor and just absolutely enthralled with the idea of taking the gospel to those that hadn't heard it, and just felt eventually called to be a pastor. Spent a lot of time listening to John MacArthur and Chuck Swindoll and David Jeremiah and Alistair Begg and all those really kind of sound, preachers from that perspective at that time in my life, of course. And during Bible college, I became convinced that pastors were supposed to be a little bit older, having had a family, that you could say, yeah, you've done a good job with your smaller clan, so here's your bigger church now. And I got pulled very much back into missions. Just I loved the idea of taking the gospel to the lost. The New Tribes had this great video called Etau, which means it is true, about missionaries that went and spent a couple of years learning the language and the culture and presenting the Bible chronologically. And eventually, when they present the gospel, the whole tribe just comes to Christ. And my heart just was like, yes, that's my future. I want to take the gospel to a lost tribe. Some medical issues and medical debt kind of sidetracked that, which was a big part of my story, a big part of even why I moved to Atlanta for a very, very special doctor. But in the long run, I was absolutely in love with Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
and I was absolutely convinced that it was real. The issues that you talked about where things are harsh or God seems harsh,
Mm-hmm.
I always chalked it up to, yeah, but if you understood the white hot holiness of God, if you understood that he's truly much more loving and fair than we would ever imagine, there's really no reason to question God. And I truly never imagined putting myself in a spot of questioning it. And if someone had said, you know, is it right to question God? I would have said, no, you don't tempt God. You don't test God. God is the king. And as you do as you're a Christian, you teach your kids, of course, to love the Lord. And we're sitting around doing Bible time with the kids, devotionals. And we're singing that song, Joshua Fought the Battle of Jericho. Are you familiar with that song?
Sure. Mm-hmm. And
And
the
of course,
walls came tumbling down.
well, let's keep coming out. And of course, the kids are just spinning and having a great time. And, we do that every night. And it dawns on me, this was about 4 years ago, it dawns on me, I know what happens next in that story. And I think you know what I'm referring to. They are commanded to commit genocide, land theft. They're commanded to take slaves, and it specifically says you're allowed to beat them until they're almost dead. You can bequeath slaves to your children because they're your property. It talks about a whole bunch of other horrible issues, including killing everyone, but taking the young girls as child brides or worse. And I sat there and I thought, what am I teaching my kids?
Mm.
Did that ever concern you, these issues where it specifically says slaughter everyone?
Oh yeah, it concerns me now, and I think there are only two ways I can live with that, I suppose. Um, well, let me say first, I start with my conception of God emanating out of what I learned from Jesus. I think as a Christian, I think Jesus came to teach us what God is like and what we should be like. And the Jesus in parable of the prodigal son and most of his stories, the God that is portrayed there is so radically different than what you're talking about and what is portrayed in what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. The only ways I can come to terms with it are one, it's possible that if you believe that the God we worship is the creator of the universe, you're talking about an unimaginable being that can spin off 1 trillion galaxies. And there's one tiny little planet here in one tiny little galaxy, and these two-legged beings that we believe God created. And when I was a kid, when I was in high school, I had an ant farm. And that kind of is an image of how God looks at planet Earth in the same way I look at my ant farm. And I would go in and kind of clean it out every once in a while and make sure it's thriving okay. And, 15, 20, or 100 ants might die in the process, but that's just what you do. I didn't spend any time grieving over the ants that died. They're insects. So one way to come to terms with that is just to say, God compared to humans, it's God's creation. He can do whatever he wants with them. Kind of that teleological suspension of the ethical that some of the reform people come up with. That's one way to look at it. And the other way to look at it is, and I lean this direction, just we're at a book recently that explores that, is to see, especially the Old Testament, as a very slanted human version of what took place, kind of like the propaganda that follows every war, where like years from now, you're going to read all this propaganda about all the good that we did for Afghanistan and Iraq and all this stuff, when actually we kind of messed up those countries pretty badly. But the history will be a very slanted history, and you can look at those accounts as, in a sense, the the nation of Israel uh, explaining themselves in a way that they can live with.
When you look at the
Because they're
parts that are Yahweh's commands, where it's not just them describing we did this and we did that, but where God actually says, go in and do this.
well, I would
Slaughter
say
the
the same.
Amalekites, hack
Sure.
Agag to pieces.
Sure. But I would say what is presented as Yahweh's commands could be part of that same propaganda.
Hmm.
When you look at the prophets, the God said this, God said that, and there are even discrepancies from book to book. So the other way to kind of rationalize that, to explain it, to come to terms with a huge problem, is to just see that as a presentation that we shouldn't take as a representation of God. Or, when you read the conservative commentators, they talk about that these were kind of amoral, violent societies, and God started with one family and then a nation, and he had to kind of purge what was going on around by getting rid of the idolatry and the prostitution and the child sacrifice, these kind of things, kind of starting all over. No way, however, does that balance out the kind of genocide that you're talking about. Yeah, it's a huge issue.
When I mentioned the name Yahweh, one of the things that
I would add one thing.
Yeah,
though,
please, go ahead.
Tim.
Go ahead.
And that is our judgment of why that's wrong in the first place. Where does that judgment come from? And you're familiar with that argument. It's kind of the C.S. Lewis Tao argument. Where does our sense of morality and Hitler didn't think that was wrong to exterminate 6 million Jews.
Which he got primarily from Lutheranism.
Yeah, you're right.
When you look at that, though, does it, like, if someone were to say, Tim, where do you get your morality from? If you're not a Christian, you don't get it from this holy book. Where do you get your morality from? And we would say, whatever, from the community, from the culture. It's part of the evolution of our consciousness. But regardless of what we would say as our answer, we would at least say we're not comfortable getting it from a book that includes those things that I listed off. And there's a lot more than that, stoning, genital mutilation. When you look at that, does it make sense that some people say, I can't take my morality from that book? I mean, for example, God goes in great detail about don't weave two kinds of fabric together, don't boil a goat in its mother's milk, all these very specific things, how you cut your hair, but he never ever says don't own people. Did that ever concern you, like the disparity of the morality issues, where it's like we think as Christians growing up our morality comes from this book, but then when you actually look at the in-depth stories in it, it's really hard to eventually say this isn't a good book. And I wanted to frame it before I pass the ball back to you. A lot of the stuff too with the Yahweh character, one of the concerns that I think the deconverting community has, and it's a big community. If you haven't seen some of the different surveys that have been going out in the last few years, it's a huge community. It's getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah, I've heard like 25 to 30 million people.
Yeah, it's and the nuns and so forth, but NONES nuns. When you look at this, though, you see this Yahweh character as a God who, and I'm going to reference to your book, The Jesus I Never Knew kind of concept, but you look at the Yahweh character and he says, in a sense, yes, I'm just, and yes, I'm holy, I've got these rules, but I love you. I love you so much. But he also says, if you don't love me back, and then the punishment. And I don't know where you are with hell, but I was taught it was, eternal punishment, very, very severe conscious punishment. if you were to say that as a husband to a wife, sweetie, I love you so much. I will do my best for you. But if you don't love me back, I will kill you.
Hmm.
911 is on the way. That's people are concerned about that being the Yahweh character. Does that
Yeah.
ever, how do you deal with that question?
If I were an Orthodox Jew, I would have a lot harder time, frankly, because again, I take my representation of God and right and wrong from Jesus, and it's remarkably different as I understand it, as I see it. And I also take the view of how it has worked out over time. There was a book you may have seen. It was well reviewed last year by Tom Holland, who's a British historian, called Dominion, and
Mm,
it's just a story of the effect of Christianity on Western civilization or all civilization. And one by one, he goes through science, education, medicine, literacy, um, care for the weak, orphanages, virtually everything that we think is good about Western civilization has a Christian source, has a Christian root. And I remember one time, my very first visit to Sweden, I thought, man, what an impressive place. No poverty. People seem very honest, charitable. Like most Scandinavian countries, they rank very high on care for the environment, care for the poor, gender equality, freedom, prosperity, all these marks of what we consider quality of life. And I happened to be reading a book on the history of Europe at the time, and it made the comment that for 250 years, prayers on the continent ended with this line: Lord, save us from the Vikings. Amen. And what struck me, what happened to transform Sweden from this warring, pillaging place of these crazy radical Vikings into modern day Sweden? Well, it was Christianity that happened. It was the gospel. And if you look at if you Google Transparency International, the least corrupt countries on earth, or the most free countries, or those that do care most about the environment. And I've done this. 19 out of 20 of them have a Christian heritage
mm,
history, like Scandinavia. Now, from what I've seen, more than half of Scandinavians don't even believe in God anymore in any practical sense. They certainly don't go to church, but they are living in the wash of what happened when Christianity changed their culture
mhm.
dramatically. So there's that side too. I mean, you're absolutely right about the dark side, especially in the old, what we call the Old Testament. But when you look at historically and even compare it to other religions, a lot of good has come from that soil.
Right. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's not mythology. In other words, you could have a worldview that includes a God, but that includes forgiving, being kind
Mm.
to your neighbor. Um, a lot of the stuff in the New Testament, even where Jesus is quoted, and this is part of another topic, which I'll keep very short for the sake of time, but a lot of the stuff comes from other sources. And one of the things that shocked me as I began to dive into the origins, I realized that the New Testament is quoting, or maybe you could call it plagiarizing, but it's quoting and referencing a lot of other outside sources. One of the things that endlessly excites me is the book of Enoch. Have you dove into that yet?
I haven't.
I knew growing up that Enoch was quoted just a little bit. It was quoted in Jude directly, and it was
Mm-hmm.
kind of referenced in the epistles of Peter. I found out as I began to dive into this that the New Testament quotes Enoch over 100 times.
Hmm.
That it quotes Jubilees dozens of times. That it quotes the Wisdom of Solomon. This is our Protestant canonical New Testament. It
Right.
quotes Sirach, Baruch, Esdras, Judith, Tobit, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, the Assumption of Moses, the Book of Jasher, the Life of Adam and Eve, the Apocalypse of Zephaniah. It's quoting all these things, and I've got a list going. It's one of my biggest projects, hopefully for next year. But to actually just put it on a silver platter for people and say, "Do you realize this book? Like when you think it's Jesus saying this, it's actually Enoch, or Paul. It's Enoch. or or it's Paul, it's actually the wisdom of Solomon, all through Romans. But then it kind of expanded to realizing, we all know there's some quotes from Paul in Acts where he's quoting pagan philosophers, but I
Right.
realized there are dozens more that are woven right into the text, and you just don't know it. Um, but then the biggest one, and this was, I wanted to really run this by you if I could. I'm going to do it quickly, but the whole idea of just where this came from, because I think even if we were to say Christianity did some good things, well, Islam, I'm sure, could point to some countries where they've radically improved certain people's well-being. I'm sure other religions could say the same thing. But the question to me is not, has someone with this worldview ever done some really good things, even really wonderful things for the culture? But simply, is it true? Because in the midst of
Right.
learning that there's some good things going on, we're also telling kids, you're wicked, you're broken before God. Even if it's mixed very much with grace and love, you need the reason you need the grace is because you're broken and wicked in the first place. There's none is righteous, no, not one. All your righteousness is like a filthy rag. And those who sin are going to deserve death. But the question is really basic to me, is where did this come from? And I wanted to ask you, I know this is going to take a minute. I apologize for the background here, but this is like my big question for you of this interview. Homer, Iliad and the Odyssey. Are you familiar with that story to some
Yes.
extent?
Mm-hmm.
Those books were like the Bible to a lot of people back then. They were emulated over and over. They would take pinnacle stories, certainly in the Iliad, the Trojan War, the Trojan Horse. They would take all these epic stories and scenes and rewrite them and craft them. And it was pretty much how you were educated in Greek societies, to take these stories and to make them into something new, and to say some similar things, but then make some differences. And people who knew the original story would say, I can see where you're shifting the story. And with the Homeric epics, I found out and this is a reference to the work of Dr. Dennis MacDonald and some other wonderful people, but the stories in the Gospels are effectively dozens of times the rewrites of what's in the Odyssey. And it's bigger than that. They're also copying from Euripides' Bacchae and a whole bunch of stuff from other people, including Pythagoras, which is really fascinating. But I wanted to just go over one story and ask for your background or your thoughts on it. In Mark, towards the end of it, Mark 14, Jesus is anointed by this woman, right? And it's to prepare for his burial. So before I read that passage, I wanted to mention this. In the Odyssey, so Odysseus has been away at Troy. It's been, well over 10 years he's been away. While he's away fighting and trying desperately to get home, and the gods, especially Poseidon, are against him and keeping him from coming back to Ithaca. While he's away, these suitors are coming to Odysseus's wife, who they say she's basically a widow. Odysseus is probably dead. And they're trying to get her to pick one of them as the new husband. And in the meanwhile, while they're waiting for her to make a choice, they're basically pillaging his house. They're living there, and they're basically turning it into a den of thieves. And so Odysseus, who had won the day with Troy by going into his, conquering the city on a horse. Again, the motifs carry over and over, but he eventually comes back. But he comes back disguised as a beggar. And when he comes into the house, some of the people are mean to him because he looks so poor. And no one recognizes him at all at first. But there is a few people that he reveals himself to, one of whom is Emmaus. You may remember that, the road to Emmaus.
Sure.
Emmaus recognizes his identity, and they began this little plot. But eventually, Odysseus is talking to his own wife, Penelope, and she doesn't recognize him yet. But she says, I'd like my servant woman here to wash her feet. Her name is Eurycleia. Eurycleia doesn't recognize him at first, but when she washes his feet, she recognizes him by a scar from a boar hunting accident. And she looks at him and she says, you're Odysseus. Oh my goodness, you're here. And her name, Eurycleia, means known far and wide. And she anoints him with water and then with oil. Then you get to, and Odysseus at that point predicts, I'm gonna take over. I'm coming back. This is about to all be changed. There's another servant named Melantho who is against him, saying, don't worry about the poor. He's a poor beggar. Ignore him. Don't treat him well. At that point, you transition to Jesus, the Jesus story. This woman anoints his feet, and the people are arguing, don't, let's think about the poor here. He's shifting it. Why aren't we taking care of the poor? And he says, just like Eureka's name means known far and wide, what this woman has done will be known far and wide. And there's a lot more. There's dozens more details to that story I could go into, and dozens more other stories. But the deconstructing community is getting, for lack of a better term, it's getting wise to the fact that a lot of these stories appear to be copied from existing mythology. And I wanted to ask, just what do you do with that, and where do you go with both the issue of knowing that there's hundreds of quotes from other books like Enoch and Jubilees that we don't get told about as Protestants, where it's coming from, and then to realize that Homeric epics are being woven in like crazy, and Euripides Bacchae and even Virgil with the Aeneid. Eventually, you get to a point where you're like, how do I know this is real? And how do you answer that?
Well, as a writer, it doesn't rattle me at all to be using other sources. If you look in the back of my book, in many of them, I refer to the sources I'm borrowing from, and there are hundreds of them. So that doesn't bother me. And it's not that I'm trying to cheat. In some ways, I'm trying to bolster my argument by saying I'm not alone. I'm not the first person that came up with this. There are other people who've looked at the same issue. So that part doesn't bother me. You're really asking a question about in what way can we accept the Bible as any sort of divine revelation?
Yes.
Yeah. And I understand that. And I frankly, a lot of what you said about the New Testament sources is new to me. I look forward to seeing your research someday. In the Old Testament, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and a lot of sources have been identified, and they help explain things like the account of the flood and creation and all of that. I don't think I could articulate. I don't think anybody can articulate how the typical accepted account of inspiration in a Christian context, how it was done. I look at the Bible authors more as an author, and I see some of them who are great writers like Isaiah, beautiful poetry, some of them who are very primitive like Amos and James particularly. And I see, however inspiration was accomplished, it worked completely through the personality and the assumptions and the education and the literateness of the authors. It wasn't unlike, say, the Book of Mormon or the Koran. They're presented as dictated by God, or existing for eternity, as the Muslims say. The Christian Bible is not like that at all. Hebrew Bible is considered more so like that. But
well, do you think Jesus could be a parable?
Do I think Jesus could be a
the
parable?
Jesus character might be a parable?
No, I think he was a historical character.
Well, I don't mean that. I mean, if there was this Jesus, and there very well may have been, but do you think the stories that were written about him were a parable, being that they're copied so extensively from other sources?
Yeah, I'd have to really take a look at your research. It's hard for me sometimes to imagine those guys, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, whoever they actually were, smart enough to do all that, to weave it together and borrow and present it as a historical chronology with fairly good correspondence with three of the books at least, so that most scholars kind of trace them back to a single source.
When you look at the Gospels, though, like the fact that there's 50 or 60 of them, did that ever concern you, that the question of why did these four get picked of the dozens that were made?
I've certainly looked at that, and when I've read some others, the Gospel of Thomas and others, the quality doesn't stand up to me. They don't have the same weight and the same feeling of authenticity as the four. I think the original guys, it took them several centuries to figure that out, and they debated it.
Yeah.
And of course, not all churches agree. The Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church, they have different lists. But in terms of the other gospels that have gotten so much attention in the last 20 years or so, from what I've read, they really don't impress me that much.
Yeah.
They have these kind of fantastic miracles of Jesus turning, making clay figures into doves and cursing his playmates and things like that just don't seem to correspond to the picture I get from the canonical gospels.
When you see that Dionysius was known for turning water into wine, and Hermes had his golden slippers to walk on the water, do the gospel stories not come across sometimes as mythological as well?
I lean on people like C.S. Lewis was a mythological expert, and he was very strong that there's a substantial absolute difference between the literary forms of the Gospels in the Bible and the mythologies that he was very familiar with. I'm not an expert; that's not my field.
Gotcha.
But he does make pretty impressive arguments that are convincing to me.
I know we're short on time, so I want to wrap it up with one question. Hell. What do you believe about what happens to people who don't believe in Jesus when they die?
I'd go back to C.S. Lewis again. The only depiction of hell that makes any sense to me is in his book, The Great Divorce. And it's
loved that book.
Yeah, and he says at one point, you have a choice of thy will be done or your will be done. And at the end of time, after death, God doesn't seem to be an arm twister to me. God respects and enhances and values human freedom. And the old line from John Milton that Lucifer says, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. The depiction of the Great Divorce is Napoleon stalking around. He finally has a little kingdom, but he's kind of alone, got his hand tucked in his pocket and just paces back and forth. Oh man, if only I'd won that battle. If only I'd won that battle. God doesn't, in my mind, force himself on us.
Do you think it's torment of any kind?
Well, if loneliness, if an unfulfilled life is a form of torment, I don't know if torment may be too strong a word, but
I mean, do you believe in flames of some kind?
No, I don't.
Okay.
No.
But people are eternally,
I believe it
in some kind of torment.
I believe that people will get what they insist on, what they want. And even here in this life, we make a lot of, look at my brother's choice. He got what he wanted all the way through, but it didn't turn out very well. And he had the freedom to do that. And I think probably the same syndrome will happen after death as well.
Yeah. I just bring that up because I think that's probably one of the biggest concerns, of a lot of us. The idea that, God started this whole thing. He's omniscient, if he were real, but, the Yahweh character starts this whole thing. He lets the enemy of our souls into the garden, into the nursery, basically. And instead of killing Satan, he chooses to kill his own son instead. And then knowing that most people, the way is narrow to life and broad to destruction, most people will not pick life. Knowing that, he chooses to still create everybody, let them have their own way, so to speak, as you mentioned, knowing that they will go there. And yet he describes himself as a good father who says, forgive endlessly, 70 times 7, forgive, forgive, forgive. But when you take your last breath, I will never forgive you again. And just the idea of, number one, why does he need blood to forgive? Why can't you just say, I forgive you? I mean, my morality is better than God at that point. I don't need an animal to say I forgive you. But when you look at it, my little boy, I've got 4 little kids. My oldest, if he ever touches the stove and hurts himself, just a millisecond of pain, that just excruciating. I can't imagine wrapping his whole body in that and then saying you're stuck in that forever. Do you resonate with people who say, I can't believe in a book that threatens people with eternal torment?
Yeah, I resonate with that. And there are a lot of people, my pastor among them, who look at those passages. You know, Gehenna was basically a garbage dump, and somehow over time, with the control mechanism of the church, it became this fire 7 times hotter than any fire you've ever seen for all of eternity over and over. I don't see that in the Bible.
Hmm. Gotcha. Gotcha. Well, I have a whole bunch more questions, so I'd love to do a follow-up someday with you. But I know we're out of time, but I just want to say thank you for what you did. Your book was fascinating. By the way, I loved it. I read through it, and you've got some very heart-wrenching stories in there. They really grab your emotions. But I appreciate too your willingness to chat with me today, because
Sure.
I think there's a lot of us. The deconstructing community is in a lot of pain in one sense because of the ostracization. Most of us do not feel invited back to the gospel. Christians, by and large, treat us as traitors, and I can absolutely say that's true. Most people get cut off, and you're not invited to church. You're not invited to the gospel. You're pretty much in a shunned position. But yet, at the same point, I had more peace in the first day after deconversion than I had in 43 years as a Christian, and people mimic that in their stories to me. So we're very confident, and the more that we dig into the mythology, the more confident that we are that this is not, real. But it's helpful for us to still talk to people that that have kind of gone a different path with this. And so I'd love to pick your brain someday with some other details on this. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Tim.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey everyone, this is Tim again, just coming back to give a little bit of an afterword for this interview. It did have to be cut off abruptly, not for bad reasons. It was just Philip Yancey had another interview to get to. Hopefully we'll get to do a follow-up at some point down the line, especially once I get done that project that I mentioned in the interview with Enoch and all that, and Pythagoras and the Homeric epics. But I did just want to give a few thoughts. I know this was a short interview. I was kind of heartbreaking that it wasn't able to be longer. I had a lot more questions. I had about 30 more questions of my own that I would probably boil down a little bit. We even into 10 or so questions. And I did have a bunch of other questions from the community to ask him. And I'm sorry I could not get to those. There's just not enough time. But we'll hopefully do a follow-up at some point. And I'm hopeful that this did kind of give Philip Yancey a little bit of an appetite to dig more into the deconstructing and deconverting community, and to also dig into the origins of Christianity. So we'll see if that pans out. Either way, I did just want to make a few comments, and I'll keep this fairly brief, most likely. Number one, if it's not already obvious, I hope it's clear, my tone and my desire in this. Our goal is not to fight the Philip Yanceys of the world. We are certainly, in one sense, deeply opposed to what they're doing. We're opposed to their worldview, but we're not fighting against them. We're fighting for them. We're begging them to come to the table and consider that there's more to this story. Just like he saw there was more to the story than the racist stuff that he'd been taught in his church, and he left it. We're kind of saying, wait a second, if you can deconstruct racist Christianity, which is, if you don't know what he was talking about, there are people that say in the Noah story with his sons that he cursed one of his sons, Ham, for something he had done in there in the book of Genesis, and that the people that descended from them were all the Black people, and therefore they were all under a curse that would just last forever. That I was taught the same thing at Bob Jones University, and I heard it in other contexts as well before then. And Philip Yancey, as many people have done, thankfully and appropriately, said that's crazy. Like, I'm not going to believe that stuff anymore. And certainly all kudos and praise to him for having deconstructed that and some other aspects of his early Christian experience. But let's think about this together. We can deconstruct racism, say the God who is portrayed to us as a God who's against certain skin colors. We can say that's not right. That doesn't sound right. And there's no way I'm believing that. There's just no way. But a God who clearly says in the text, go commit genocide, land theft, slavery, child brides, genital mutilation, stoning, slavery forever, tricking your slaves, beating your slaves till they're almost dead. We can't deconstruct that. We deconstruct racism, but not genocide. And people can explain it away. You'll find endless Christian ways of explaining away the genocide. If it's in your book, I mean, this is like, you got to step away for a second and think about this. If you have a book that says, go slaughter everyone and take the young girls that are still virgins, take them for yourselves, but kill everyone. Even if you want to interpret it different ways, it's kind of like that thing we're all taught very clearly about an airport. You don't shout, I've got a bomb. Even if you're kidding, you don't do it. You just don't. You never, ever, under any circumstances, go to an airport and say, I've got a bomb. It's not a joke. It's not a joking matter. And we know that. If the Bible was written by Yahweh, if the Bible was inspired by the true God of the universe, who is, as Philip Yancey started saying, he can spit out universes in a millisecond, just like bam, there they all are. If he's that smart, then he's also smart enough to know not to give us any intimation that genocide, land theft, slavery, genital mutilation, child brides, that stuff is acceptable. And those verses have been behind an incredible amount of horrific violence by the church for centuries. And the way that they treat slaves has gone on even to just a couple generations ago. We know that. It's very real in our culture. You go back further, the Crusades and all these stories, you know that they use these verses to justify unbelievable violence. If Yahweh were real, he would have known that, and he could have easily stopped it and just said, don't own people. Don't commit genocide. I will give you this land, but I'll do it in a way that's peaceful. You won't have to slaughter little babies and 5-year-old little boys. You won't have to. You won't have to kill old grandmas. And even if that stuff didn't happen, which I think a lot of it probably did not happen the way it was described, but regardless of whether or not it's historical and to what extent, if your book says it happened that way, you know that there are certain people who are going to take it that way. It says, I take God at his word. That'll preach. Take God at his word. God says it. I believe it. That settles it. God said, go in and slaughter them. Don't leave anyone. Hack Agag to pieces. Kill the Amalekites. Slaughter everything but keep the young girls. That's what it says. Why would you, as a Christian who says this is the infallible word of God, why would you question that? You're taught not to question God. So why would you suddenly say, well, that probably didn't happen? Even if you give yourself the freedom to question it, it still doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound right at all. We're inviting someone like Philip Yancey to the table to say, Philip Yancey, you're better than this. You're better than a book that includes the Yahweh character, and it's a character. He's not a real person. He's not a real entity. Yahweh did not create this. Yahweh is a character. This is part of what I wanted to get to and didn't have time for, but Yahweh was part of a pantheon of Canaanite deities. Yahweh was the son of Elyon and Asherah originally. There were other demigods, Baal and so forth. And they shifted the story, and Yahweh became the same as Elyon, and his wife was Asherah. There's Yahweh and his Asherah. And eventually they took Asherah out of the story. That's mythology. The Yahweh character is not what you're seeing in the Bible. The Yahweh character has a much bigger history. And if you don't know that history, it's just, you can't even start. You need to know where Yahweh came from. Yahweh came from ancient Canaanite mythology, which was a pantheon. There were many gods involved in this story. And Asherah was a much stronger god in some ways. She was much more powerful and much more involved in Israel's history than you will ever see in the Bible. But when you look at archaeology and the historians, they'll tell you. And you can't hide it. It's been well known for a long time. Christian apologists don't give you that. And that's one of the frustrations is when you're first deconstructing, you kind of like, oh, I'm scared. Maybe there's an issue here. Maybe there's some holes in this story. And apologists say, no, there's no holes. We're good. But then you go back and you shift, and eventually you see, wait, the apologists are not telling me the whole story. They're giving me a partial story, and they're also trying to do this whole, like Wizard of Oz, don't look behind the curtain. Just trust me. That's not what's going to happen here. What's going to happen here is the truth. We're going to get to archaeology. We're going to get to historians, real historians, who will tell you the full story. And Yahweh, the Yahweh character, is part of a pantheon of ancient Canaanite mythology. And arguably, they came out of Egypt in many ways. Egypt were the ones who had blood magic. They had genital mutilation. They had a pork taboo. This stuff is out of Egypt. That's crystal clear. And so we're asking Philip Yancey, you want to believe in Jesus, but I think he would have said Jesus is the same as the Father. I and the Father are one. It says in John, Yahweh is Jesus. So if Yahweh commanded genocide, Jesus commanded genocide. You can't say the Jesus I never knew was, he's so loving. Well, the Jesus you never knew is Yahweh. And Jesus, unless you're going to go the Marcion path, um, this Jesus is the God of genocide. He is the God of genital mutilation. He is the God of slavery and land theft, stonings, certainly advanced tribalism, horrible stuff. I mean, it goes on and on. And those of you who watch my videos, you know that. We're inviting Philip Yancey to say, you're better than this. You've deconstructed enough to say this important but small piece in the big picture is wrong. But you've got this glaring issue. Why say I can't accept the God of racism, but I'll accept the God of genocide? And you cannot divorce Jesus from Yahweh. You cannot. Jesus said, I've not come to overturn the law. I've come to fulfill it. I'm not coming I'm not coming here to say the Old Testament's bunk. I'm coming here to fulfill what it prophesied. At least that's the way the authors of the New Testament, some of them, again, there's a lot more than we know about, but that's the way some of them portrayed him. He says, I'm here to fulfill Yahweh. I'm not here to overturn him. And so these holes just get bigger and bigger. And the other part of this I wanted to land on, and I'll try to keep this short too, is I hope you saw really clearly, and this is not an attack against Philip Yancey, because anything I'm about to say here, I would say to myself too, I'm certainly was not a superstar in Christianity like he is. No one knows my name and everyone knows his name. And that's for sure. But in the sense that what I'm about to say is going to sound like it's against him. It's not. It's equally. I'm just as much at fault in this. But Philip Yancey and Christians by and large have no idea where their book came from. He is swinging out, as it were, into eternity on this fact that Jesus and the Bible came from God, of some kind of divine inspiration. No matter how you slice certain passages, God, the God of the universe, did this. He gave us this book of love. And I'm going to die and swing it into eternity, knowing that my hands are safe in the arms of this loving Savior who died and rose again. And his blood covers me. I'm saved by his blood. I'm washed. I'm cleaned. My sin has been resolved. And you ask him these questions, you bring up these points, and he has no idea where the book came from. How can someone who has been a superstar in the Christian world for decades not know that the book of Enoch is quoted 100 times in the New Testament? How can he not know the book of Jubilees is quoted dozens of times? How can he not know about Pythagoras woven in over and over? How can he know about Homer? I mean, oh my goodness, the Iliad and the Odyssey are woven dozens of times in both structure and storylines and quotes and intricate details over and over and over. If you're not familiar with the work of Dennis MacDonald, you gotta get it. You gotta get familiar with it. When you look at this, and this is a list I've given before, and this is not the full list, but you find out Paul's resurrection of Eutychus is based on the Odyssey's fate of Elpenor. Mary's washing of Jesus's feet, she's not listed as Mary in the book of Mark, but she's called Mary, I believe, later. It's a rewrite of Euryclea, her washing of Odysseus's feet in the Odyssey. The visions of Peter and Cornelius are based on the story of Iliad's Agamemnon. Paul's farewell at Miletus is based on Hector's farewell to Andromache. The lottery of Matthias in the beginning part of Acts is based on the lottery of Ajax. Peter's escape from prison borrows details from Priam's escape from Achilles. You end up seeing a lot of connections. The Zacchaeus story with Bacchaeus, the Bacchae, Euripides Bacchae, Zacchaeus, Bacchaeus. The whole Timaeus, Bartimaeus, Plato's Timaeus. Jesus heals blind Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. You start to see these connections. The Gamaliel character in the New Testament is just quoting Tiresias. The Paul and Peter stories often mirror and quote from the Pantheist stories. You add in endless quotes from Plutarch, from Philo, direct allusions and copies of stories from Pythagoras, over and over and over. And this stuff is not that hard to find. And again, I listed these other books from the intertestamental period and so forth, but I'll just list them one more time. Endless quotes from Enoch, the Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach or Ecclesiasticus, Baruch, Esdras, Jubilees, Judith, Tobit, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, the Assumption of Moses, the Book of Jasher, the Life of Adam and Eve, the Apocalypse of Zephaniah. How can someone be a superstar in the Christian world and not know that those books are quoted hundreds of times in the Protestant canonical New Testament? You'd say that's impossible, but that's what almost every Christian I've ever spoken to would testify to. I'll say I had no idea. I knew it quotes Enoch at the beginning of Jude there, and referenced again in the Peter's epistles. I didn't know. And you bring up things like Pythagoras. John 21, this classic. Pythagoras was a math cult leader. He saw the world through this very cultish, mythological eyes, but it was based on math. And one of his most sacred numbers was 153. And there's this story told where he goes to fishermen and he says, if I can predict to you how many fish you're about to catch, will you promise me you'll put them back in the water, throw them back? And they take the bet. And in the story, of course, he guesses it correctly. And they don't tell you in that story what the number was, but that he guessed it right and they had to do it. Well, we know from history that Pythagoras is one of his main sacred numbers was 153. You get to John 21 and you get to these stories and you find out that Jesus goes to the fishermen and he says, throw your nets in, and they do it. They pull this massive haul of fish in and they count them. Like, you're really going to stop when the risen Lord that you thought might be gone forever, the risen Lord has appeared to you, done this miracle with the fish, and he's sitting there on the beach willing to offer you breakfast and talk to you. And you're going to say, let's stop and count the fish. Right. No, you're going to stare at your risen Lord and Savior. You won't care how many fish there are. But this story has to tell you they counted them, and it's 153 fish. That's Pythagorean on steroids, as is the book of Revelation, as is Luke, I believe, chapter 2 with the woman in the temple that's there till she's like 84. Endless stories. When you look at this big picture, there's so many questions that come up in the Gospels that just, you'd say some of this stuff seems so weird and so like quirky. Like, why in the Garden of Eden was there a naked young man who was running away? Why did Jesus curse a fig tree out of season? Why was he crucified between two criminals? Why were there two feedings of large crowds? And in the first one in Mark, it's all men. And it literally says the word aner, which is men versus women, aner, and not anthropos, meaning humankind. It's only men in the first one, and then it's a mixed crowd. And do they not ever wonder, maybe in the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey, there's two feasts, and the first one starts with all men, and the second one is a mixed crowd? Why is Jesus known by his scars? Why are the chief priests needing Jesus to identify Jesus, even though he was well known? They knew who he was. He was a public figure. Why do they need Jesus to give him a kiss and to identify him? Why did Jesus make such a big deal of keeping his identity a secret throughout the whole Gospels? Why did Jesus travel by ship so often in Mark? Mark was the first gospel written. The others were copycats and so forth. But he travels so much by ship in Mark, where it all starts from, but not in the other Gospels. Why does Jesus have 12 shipmates? Why does Mark talk about the main boat for Jesus and then a bunch of little other boats that accompany the main boat? Why the Sea of Galilee, which is really just a big lake? Why is it described as a raging sea with wild, violent storms that can capsize boats? Why are James and John treated like twins? Always, James and his brother John. Why are they treated like twins all the time? And why does Jesus call them sons of thunder? How does an anonymous woman in this passage we talked about in Mark 14, how does an anonymous woman gain worldwide fame? She's not even named by Mark. Mark doesn't even tell you who she is. How does an anonymous woman gain worldwide fame? Before Jesus walked on the water, it says he was looking down on them from a mountain, and the disciples were so afraid of him as they saw him walk from a distance. Why did he have to be on a mountain? How can Jesus suddenly disappear from crowds that want to throw him off a cliff, like in Luke 4 and John 10? Every one of these issues and dozens more of weird, quirky things, you can answer every single one of them if you're familiar intimately familiar with the Iliad and the Odyssey. They all stem from it, all of them. And I'm only touching the surface of many of them. The Iliad and the Odyssey is where it's at. You add in the book of Enoch, and you have a book that is absolutely just dripping with mythology. And by the way, the whole Jesus walking on the water thing, being on the mountain, Zeus had seen some people on the ground that needed to escape the city. I forget their names, but they needed to go, to their homeland before they were going to get slaughtered. And he wants to get them to go quickly, and he sends Hermes to go help them. Hermes is the one with the little wings off of his feet. He's like the Flash, super fast. Hermes puts on these golden slippers that allow him to walk across the water and get to them, and he can quickly, and says they're afraid as they see Hermes coming toward them, and he helps them, escape and get to safety. Jesus, looking down on them from a mountain, sees them in the boat, and he walks on the water right to them, over and over and over. And I'm scratching the surface. It's like I'm just touching, a dozen or so things here. There's hundreds of these that get much, much, much deeper. You look in depth at the Cyclops with Polyphemus. Oh my goodness, amazing story where that's woven right into the Gospels. Again, Mark 6, where Jesus walks the water. Jesus curing a boy with a demon, based on Euripides' Madness of Heracles, or Hercules in Latin, one of the sons of Zeus. So other stories being brought in here. Jesus' transfiguration, that has to do with what Athena was doing with Odysseus in the Odyssey. Cleaning out the den of robbers. Jesus calls this a den of robbers, this temple, and he clears it out. Odysseus does the same thing. If you're not familiar with it, he comes in, and there's all these suitors are waiting for Penelope to make a decision. And of course, she's saying, "Oh, I'm not going to make a decision until I've woven this piece of fabric. I'm done. When I'm done, I'll make a decision." And so she kind of gets him to wait. And while they're waiting, and ravaging his house, drinking all of his food and wine for years, basically pillaging his wealth, Odysseus' wealth, and telling her he's dead. He's not coming back. They're making it into a den of thieves. Jesus comes into the temple and says, "You've made my house into a den of thieves." It's absolutely unbelievable. And the passage I mentioned with Euryclea washing Odysseus' feet, and just like the woman that washed Jesus' feet, right before then, Mark 12:38-40, Jesus says, and in his teaching he was saying, "Beware the scribes who like to walk around in long robes, and they like personal greetings in the marketplaces, and seats of honor in the synagogues, and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for appearance's sake offer long prayers. They will receive all the more condemnation." And then in Mark 13:34-36, it's like a man away on a journey. This is the Bible, not the Odyssey. It is like a man away on a journey, who, upon leaving his house and putting his slaves in charge, assigning to each one his task, also commanded the doorkeeper to stay alert. Therefore stay alert, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, whether in the evening, at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, so that he does not come suddenly and find you asleep. That is exactly what happened in the Odyssey, written 700 years earlier. Judas says about Judas, "It would have been better for him to have not been born." Says Mark 14:21, "Woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." In the Odyssey, Odysseus' slave Melanthius, he betrays Odysseus and fights for the suitors. When the battle is over, Odysseus, he's in charge again. Odysseus and those who had fought with him brutally torture Melanthius for his treachery. It would absolutely, and I won't even mention what they did to him. It's not appropriate in this video, but what they did was off the charts brutal. And it definitely would have been better if Melanthius had never been born, based on how his end of his life happened. Odysseus overturns tables as he cleans out his house and kills all the suitors who had stolen from him all those years. Jesus cleanses the temple, overturning tables over and over and over. And when you add in, I'm not going to go into everything else that I could here, but we've talked about Yahweh's origins, but the zodiac, Mark being structured according to the zodiac in the right order of the constellations. Are you kidding me? Then you get into the Old Testament with some bizarre stuff. We talked about a lot of it, but you get a God who says, "I used to talk to you like verbally. Now I want you to use magic stones, the Urim and Thummim. these little stones that would go in a bag, and you pick out which one, and oh, that means God wants us to go left, and this one means he wants us to go right. So God used to speak to you, but now he wants to use magic stones. Right. And if a man is jealous that his wife might have been sleeping around and then the baby inside of her is not his, he can go to the priest and have him concoct a magic dust water formula. And it's the only time that abortion is really just laid out in the Bible. And it's a prescription for how to abort a baby. That's your pro-life God. In addition to slaughtering everyone in the Noah's flood story, slaughtering the firstborn of Egypt, slaughtering all the children in Canaan, slaughter. God just goes to town, killing babies left and right. And when he finally has a chance to be really, really honing on the issue, he says, I'm going to give you a recipe for how to abort a baby. That's your God. Treats women like garbage. Says, women, if a man rapes you in the field, in many cases, all the daddy has to do is pay 50 shekels of silver. You have to become his wife, and you cannot ever leave. The patriarchy on steroids, over and over and over. Why is it always men writing these rules? Why is it always men getting the word from God? You see occasional snippets where maybe it's different. Deborah, Virgin Mary, a few other people. But Esther, by and large, it's predominantly men who get the message from God, men who determine which books are in the Bible, men who put books in and take them back out hundreds of years later. If you don't at some point question yourself and say, maybe this whole thing is mythologized. Yeah, there could have been a Jesus. Doesn't mean there wasn't a Jesus. I'm not trying to advocate for mythicism here. That'll be a topic for another day for sure. But whether there was a guy named Jesus, and there were lots of guys named Jesus. That's named Joshua, Yeshua. It's a very, very common name. There certainly could have been a guy in someone's mind. As I write this, I'm thinking of Yeshua. He lives down the street from me. He's a magician or he's a preacher, whatever. But the way they mythologized these stories and endless borrowing from other sources. And I've even talked about mystery cults and the dying and rising gods. Oh my goodness, that could be hours. But you weave all that stuff in. You're like, what's left? How do I know that this isn't just pure mythology? I mean, purely, almost every little ounce of it. Almost every story in the Gospels I can attribute to the Iliad, the Odyssey, Euripides, Bacchae, Virgil's Aeneid, Pythagoras, and I can see him endlessly quoting from Enoch and even these outside philosophers from Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, even Aesop. I'm like, this list just goes on and on. You don't even know who you're reading anymore. You don't. And Christians need to understand when they go devotional, let me read my Bible. God, what do you have for me today? Oh, let me flip to the Gospels. Let me read what Jesus said. Let's go to the Sermon on the Mount. You don't realize that's not Jesus speaking. He's quoting other people. He's quoting other people all over the place. Not like, oh, this little fraction here, this little snippet here, one word here, phrase there. No. Huge, massive, endless chunks of your Bible. And you add on that, of course, the idea that we touched on. How do you know that your Bible is the right one? There's like 50 to 60 Gospels total that we know of, probably more. When it came time for them to decide on the canon in the 300 and 400s AD, in terms of the books that would have fit into Christian Gospels and Christian epistles and Christian apocalyptic works, the quantity of books that they could choose from was in the hundreds of books. Wrap your mind around that a little bit. Hundreds of books. At least, again, 50 to 60 books of Gospels that we know of, at least 6 different books of Acts. The idea that we would trust people who were politically motivated, obviously, Constantine played a big role in this, politics and power, men, not women, making these decisions. The fact that we would put our lives and be willing, and this is the clincher, we're willing to trust men that we don't know, men who made decisions about books that we don't even know who wrote them. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not the authors. We don't know who wrote those Gospels. Somebody wrote books, and we don't know who, and some other men that we don't know any way to trust what their motivations were. We're going to trust them that they gave us the right books out of hundreds. And we know that that got very messy. The Ethiopian church, they've had the Book of Enoch from day one. They've never lost it. And someone like myself and Philip Yancey never even heard of that book. Certainly didn't have any reason to think it was related to the New Testament. This stuff is, it's insane and it's mind-blowing. And I'm inviting someone like Philip Yancey, again, to wrap this up, I'm inviting Philip Yancey to come to the table and say, I need to know if this is true. Did he really quote the Book of Enoch 100 times? Did he quote Jubilees dozens of times? Is he mimicking Pythagoras? Is he mimicking Homer's Iliad and Odyssey? If he's mimicking all these stuff, these things, all these stories over and over and over and creating Mark, the first gospel, and that it evolved from there, how in the world are you putting your entire worldview on this? And what's worse, the clincher, how do you teach your kids that this Bronze Age God named Yahweh, who used to be the son of Elyon and Asherah and then became Elyon and had Asherah and then didn't, that this God who demands blood, lots of blood, and wants to cut off the end of little boys' penises, is your true Lord and Savior. And he loves you so much, but if you don't love him back, he will torture you, or let you be tortured, if that would be more comfortable for someone like Philip Yancey to say. He'll let you torture yourself, however the phrasing should go. That God says to you, I love you, but you're wicked, and you got a big sin problem. There's no good news until we get to the bad news. The bad news is you are broken. You are wicked. You've fallen short. All your righteousness is like a filthy rag. And you will bow your knee to my provision, the only righteousness that's available to you. Your own righteousness is not an option. You will die in your sins if you claim your own righteousness. But if you will let the righteousness of Christ be your covering, he will be the spotless lamb who takes away the sins of the world. If you will let his blood cover you, take care of your sin problem, and you identify with his death and resurrection, you will inherit eternal life. Imagine kids who are naturally so willing to feel the pain of other people. You know, a kid sees another kid fall off the bike, scrape their knee, start screaming and crying. They run to him to help them. Christian or not, any other religion, they run to help them. Imagine a kid in a church, maybe a Catholic church where there's a statue, or a Protestant church, maybe a picture in a book. You see this Jesus character with his crown of thorns and the blood running down. You see the nails in his hands and in his feet. You see the sword in his side with the blood and the water spilling out. And you get a kid who's so sensitive to, oh man, I don't want to see people in pain. And then you show them this guy in the most intense pain that, you know, you'd otherwise never show a child someone being tortured. And yet you show them this torture picture and you say, Johnny, Susie, that guy up there and that statue, that's real. You really did do that. And the reason he went there is because of our sin, and including your sin. You are part of this problem. And if you had been the only person and you had eaten that fruit in the garden, Jesus would have had to do the same thing for you. You are that wicked. Your sin is that big of a problem. He would have died just for your sins. He is bleeding and in excruciating pain because of you. This is your fault. This is all of our faults as humans, but you included. You are to blame for him being on that cross. The psychological manipulation and abuse of children in saying that is off the charts, and it's sick. Friends, this is some dark stuff. We're fighting a very, very, very dark worldview. And again, our fight is not against people. We love the people. We can't stand the worldview. If you want to take something good out of it, oh, turn the other cheek, forgive 70 times 7, that's fine. You can find that stuff in Greek philosophy anyway. That's where most of it came from. You don't need blood magic and scapegoating to take the good things out of Christianity. You can take good things still. But if you're going to preach this stuff to kids, tell them you're wicked before this Yahweh character who wants blood and all this stuff. And he'll love you so much, but if you don't love him back, he'll torture you. We will fight tooth and nail on the worldview level with our thoughts and our speech and our writing to say mythology has to end as a worldview. Philip Yancey seems like an amazing guy. He seems awesome. He seems like he's done a lot of deep thinking and he's been through some horrible stuff. We didn't get to touch a fraction of what he's been through. His journey has been endlessly painful. And you can't read his book, again, Where the Light Fell. You can't read his book without just thinking, oh my goodness, how many times does someone have to beat you down? And he just kept on getting up. He figured a way to be healthy. He figured a way to get past the horrible, toxic stuff he faced. Kudos to him for that. But at some point, we have to say enough. Just like he said, enough to the racism. We have to say enough to the mythology as a worldview. You can't keep hurting kids with this stuff. Kids do not need blood magic. They do not need a dying and rising savior figure. Kids are awesome just the way they are. Yahweh isn't real. Jesus is not real. There may have been, again, a historical character named Yeshua, but Jesus is the character that we're seeing portrayed in the Gospels in the New Testament. He is not real. None of it's real. It's never been real, not a single day. And we're begging Philip Yancey to do what we're doing, to say we don't know how many years we have left, but to take whatever years you do have left and to undo the damage. I have gone to people to whom I have preached the gospel. I've gone to people, to my own children, which, is old news at this point, but gone to people and said, I am sorry for what I did. I did it in the best intention at the time, but I did it in ignorance. To quote Jesus, forgive them for they don't know what they do. I did not know what I was doing. I did not know where this book came from. And I suspect if most Christians really knew and were willing to, with open eyes and an honest perspective, admit where this book came from, they would be horrified. They would feel lied to. They would feel sick to their stomach. And they'd be willing to join the fight and say, oh my goodness, if this is where this came from, and I'm teaching my kids that this is literally the word of a God, oh my goodness, this has to end. That's our vision. That's our passion. And we're gonna do our best. And we're gonna keep on exposing the truth of where this book came from. So that in the future, Christian superstar writers and preachers, that they will have to face these issues further and further. The stuff with Homer is called mimesis or mimesis criticism, talking about mirroring stuff, imitating it, trying to take a story and rewrite it in a way that you reflect the new values and change some things, make it, and the differences pop to the people who knew the first story. Like if you took the Star Wars story and then you made a different one with some very similar themes, but something was different, where Luke Skywalker was the bad guy and Darth Vader ended up being the hero. Where you change things and the people that know the first story know, yeah, this is a different story, but I can see enough parallels to see where you got it from, and I can see what you changed. And the differences do stand out to me. And Philo talked a lot about that, about how to do that kind of changing of stories and make dramatic shifts and ironies. As we look at this, though, we will do our best so that in the future, as Christians, keep on leaving the church, keep on leaving and saying this isn't right, whether it's because of Trump kind of stuff, Trump nationalism, or homosexuality, or any other issues, whatever the reason they start the conversation with, or even the simple question of suffering. Why does God let 3-year-olds die of cancer? Why is he letting people die of coronavirus all the time? Why couldn't you have just stopped it? Whatever your starting point is, you need to quickly add the truth of where this came from, meaning mythology. And when you add that, Christians of the next generation, Christian preachers, apologists, writers, they will not be able to just write devotional books anymore, because people will get smarter and say, you keep on assuming Jesus, the Jesus I never knew. Well, what if Jesus isn't even real? You can't start with, I wanted to learn what Jesus was really like because I was misled that maybe he was like this and he was really like this, without answering the question, is he actually even there in the first place? We're going to make that so clear to people that they're going to have to, Christians will have to answer this question, not is Jesus loving or isn't he? Is he like Yahweh? Would he have commanded genocide or not? The question is not, is God good? The question is not, is God a monster? The question, is God there? You can ask these other questions all you want, and there's lots of channels that focus on it, and I'm going to do it a little bit, but not much. Is God a moral monster? Is genocide ever appropriate? Is slavery ever appropriate? Answer those questions if you really want to. But the question is not, that's not where you're going to get your bang for your buck. The money shot is in this question: is this God that we keep talking about even there? And I highly encourage you to consider, if you have not ever, for the first time in your life, consider the possibility that this is not real. It's not real. You think you've been praying to a God, you've been talking to yourself. And anything good where you're like, well, I was dealing with depression and I got saved and now I'm fine. I've got joy of the Lord. I was dealing with this issue and, something happened. I got serious about God and bam, I feel like light came in my life again. That's good. That's good. You got off your alcohol or whatever. So happy that happened. Other religions claim the same thing. They would claim this God and that God and this God and this, and they've been doing it for generations and cultures. People used to say the same thing about their gods. Their gods, Dionysius brought life and peace and joy to them. Turned their life around. Dionysius did. That was very well known, very common. All these gods did. People would worship Athena and Hermes and Zeus, of course. All these other gods brought joy and peace and transformation. The issue is not that something transformed your life and you became such a better person. The issue is questioning, is the person that I'm putting this on, attributing it to in a good sense, is that person really there? And if they're not there, if Zeus isn't really there, if Dionysus isn't really there, Jesus and Yahweh aren't really there, then this is you. You're the one making your life better. You're the one making the choice to get off alcohol. You're the one choosing to see life through different eyes. You're the one making the improvement. Just because your life got better with Jesus doesn't mean it's Jesus. Your life got better with Jesus because you made good choices. Doesn't mean Jesus was there. I am heartbroken for Philip Yancey. Christianity broke my heart. And he mentioned C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis talked about he didn't want to become a Christian. He had to fight it. He didn't think it was real. And it says he went kicking and screaming into the kingdom. I went kicking and screaming out of it. I did not want to admit that this was mythology. It took me a long, long time. And it still in some ways breaks my heart. I absolutely thought the afterlife was real. I wanted it desperately. I still do. I wish I could live forever. But there comes a time to deal with the facts of how mythology and mystery cults and dying and rising gods and the Homeric epics and Euripides' Bacchae, how these come into the equation, how Pythagoreanism comes in. It comes in a lot. It comes in overwhelmingly. If we don't face these, all we're doing is playing games. And I'm sorry to say it, but Philip Yancey and a lot of other people like him have devoted their lives to a phantom, to an illusion, to a nothing. And you may think that's okay because you're using words like grace and forgiveness. Yeah, there's something to be said about that. I'm glad that grace and forgiveness dropped from Philip Yancey's lips so much. Wonderful. But at what cost? Why can't we say grace and forgiveness without Yahweh and hell? Why can't we say grace and forgiveness and learning through our suffering and becoming better through these pains? Why can't we learn from all these things and become better people without blood magic and scapegoating? Why can't God just forgive? Why does there have to be a sacrifice? And is a 3-day sacrifice of an eternal, immortal being really a sacrifice? A guy who knows he's going to rise again in 3 days and it's all going to be over? Is that really a sacrifice? It doesn't make sense. The more you dig into this, and I'm scratching the surface of the surface of the surface here in many ways, this just doesn't make sense. And I'd like to invite Philip Yancey to consider redeeming the years of his life that are left and saying, I deconstructed whatever, a quarter of the way, half the way. It's time to take this thing home. I need to undo the damage that I've done by directing people to mythology. As you directed people to grace and forgiveness and love and any other good messages you sent, you at the same time directed people toward mythology. And there might be a few people with liberal Christianity that kind of really paint a very sweet and easy picture with that. Most Christians that I know of, that I come from, do not. It is harsh. I'm not talking about their personalities, but the message of the gospel. There is no good news without the bad news. You are destined to hell without the grace of God, whatever that hell looks like. You're scaring kids over mythology. You're torturing people with shame over their sexuality, over mythology. You're making people make lifelong decisions about school and marriage and all that stuff and jobs over mythology. The list of ways that this stuff hurts people could go on and on and on. And if you watch my channel, we talk about it quite a bit. I'd like to believe better of Philip Yancey. I'd like to invite him to dig into this mythology stuff a lot more, and to be able to say, in a year or two, whenever he's done his time with the research, it's addicting, so I don't think he'd stop after a year or two. But to say in a year or two, I can say I've done my homework. I dug into Enoch. I dug into Jubilees. I dug into Pythagoras. I dug into the Iliad and the Odyssey. I dug into Euripides' Bacchae. And holy smokes, wow. I did not know. But now the scales have fallen from my eyes and I am free. Jesus, that whole story, it's not real. I'm sorry, guys. It almost brings tears to my eyes. It breaks your heart to think about, because you wanted it so much to be real. You dedicated your life to it. It was the beating of your heart. Jesus, I want your glory to shine. I want your kingdom to come. I want people to be in the kingdom with me. I do not want people to be dying in their sins. I do not want people hopeless. Those messages preach. And for people who are desperate for light, when they're in a dark spot, the desperation, it just pierces that darkness. Yes, God is on your side. He's been fighting for you. He's been writing a story. Your story is like a poem. And you're on the first or second stanza that's dark, but it's going to turn soon. And this poem is going to get awesome. And this song that sounds like it's in a minor tone is going to turn to a major soon. You have a God who loves you, who's been following your story. He's got a love letter to you in the Bible, and he loves you more than words can say. I understand the appeal of that. I understand the appeal of saying you need to stop trying to earn God's favor. He did it all. It's not about your good works. Christ paid it all on the cross. He did it. Stop working. Open your hands. Turn from your sin. Turn from yourself. Turn from the world. Turn from the devil. Look at God and open your hands and let him give you the free gift of salvation. It's just waiting for you. All you have to do is say, God, I repent of my sins. I turn to you and I freely accept the gift of your salvation, Jesus' death and resurrection on my behalf. And that by identifying with him and letting him be the one who's my substitute that took my sin upon himself, I will be rescued from death, from sin. I will go to heaven. I understand how amazing that sounds. I understand why we want it to be true. I did not leave because I wanted to sin. I did not leave because somebody hurt me. I did not leave because I was tired of certain messages from the church about certain topics. Certain people do, and that's fine. It took me a lot more. I had to dive into the mythology. And when you dive in, despite how good grace sounds, what's so amazing about grace, it sounds so cool. Christianity makes grace ugly. It makes it horrific. Between the Yahweh character, what he did, the blood magic, the threat of hell, the way it manipulates and abuses children's minds with brainwashing and manipulation, psychological abuse. If you want to truly tell me what's amazing about grace, Tell me what's amazing about grace without Yahweh, without Jesus. What's so amazing about grace? You want to know what's so amazing about grace? Is I can have it without a God. I can have grace without a God. I can receive it, experience it, thrive in it, lavishly enjoy it, lavishly give it without any gods. I do every day. I love when my kids, I love when my family, I love when the people at work. I thrive to bless people. My life, I think constantly about the poor people around me that I want to help, about the people who are depressed and struggling. I just want to bless people's socks off. I want to show grace upon grace upon grace. And it has nothing to do with God. What's so amazing about grace, Philip Yancey? Think about it. Grace with strings attached is not grace. Grace where someone says, I created this problem. I created this massive problem where I created you faulty. I created you with the ability to sin, knowing you would sin, knowing that most of you would reject the right path. I created you anyway, and I put the enemy of your souls in the garden with you. And now all of you, just as I predicted, just as I knew, made the wrong choice. The few of you that made the right choice, great, you get to enjoy it, but the path there is very narrow. The path to destruction is wide, Jesus says. Most of you are going to die in your sins. But God creates the problem, and then he creates the solution by sending his son, who is himself. He sends himself so he can kill himself to appease himself. He kills himself to appease himself so that he can give you this gift and say, here's your get out of jail free card. Accept it. Accept the grace of God. Accept the gospel. But if you don't, punishment upon punishment. That's extortion. That's the definition of extortion. You have a psycho God at the core of Christianity. Philip Yancey can't explain that away. You can't liberal Christianize that away. There is a psycho God with a psycho gospel and a psychotic outcome for those who don't bow their knee to Jesus. I gladly confess Yahweh is not God. Jesus is not Lord. He's not Savior. They're not real. And so in that vein, especially with a platform where I'm not privately wrangling over these things, I'm publicly saying Jesus is not God, and I do not confess him as Lord. I deny him in every sense. To Philip Yancey, I'm going to hell. Whatever that looks like. Whatever hell, whatever life deprived of God and his blessings and the light looks like, whatever extreme darkness looks like, that's where I'm headed forever, because I oppose these stories, because I do not bow my knee, so to speak, to the cross. Guys, that's sick. We're talking about some sick, sick stuff, dark stuff. It breaks your heart. It breaks your heart to realize it's not real. It breaks your heart to realize people are still stuck in it and they can't see it. Their scales over their eyes were so thick. We have to try. We can't save everybody from this stuff. Some of this stuff is just going to take generations passing before, the trends are going. People are leaving the church. The nuns are going up and the people in church are going down. Generations will have to pass before some of this dies out, but we can help some people. I get emails from people every week. Some of them, say I help them, but most of them, it's a bigger picture. I love it when I'm part of their story. But people say, ditto, Tim, ditto. I thought this was real. And I can't believe I'm saying it, but I realize it's not real. And I feel like I won the lottery. I'm free. I'm free of this God who I always thought was looking at me and judging me. And I had to always ask, what is your will? And are you angry at me? Am I doing the right thing? And what's your plan for me? And how does this work? Am I worshiping you enough? Am I spending enough time with you? It's all in your mind. He's never been there. And people realize this and they say, I'm free. I'm free. And the peace that comes is overwhelming, realizing that you could have gone to your deathbed completely passionate and dedicated to mythology. It'll make you sick to your stomach to realize just a few cards could have gone differently, a few chips fallen differently, and you would have never learned enough to escape. It'll shake you to your core. You could have gone to your deathbed praying, Jesus, I can't wait to see you in 5 minutes when I die. And if you could come back to life somehow in some, magic story for a minute after your death and look at your life and say, my life's not over. I'm going to make one final statement about it. Knowing, if you could know, what comes next, you'd say, I thought this was next. I thought heaven was next. I thought the glory of God was next. Nothing's next. I just died. It's over. And you get one chance to look at your own life and say, what do I want on my gravestone that would be actually accurately representing me? And you'd have to say, I wasted my life on mythology. If that doesn't shake you up, I don't know what could. Whew, that's some deep stuff. I know I went deep in these comments, but I feel like it's such a burden on my heart. This is what the platform's about. This is what I'm about. I love helping people get free. I love helping people understand mythology. And I've got a lot I've learned, but I've got a whole lot more I still need to learn. And I have a feeling that, like I say, when I first left, I felt like I had, 100 good reasons. I feel like at this point, I've now got a couple thousand good reasons. I suspect over the next few years, it'll look like I've got, tens of thousands of good reasons. Because I discover more and more every day about where they're copying from other things, from Philo and Plutarch and Plato. And your jaw just keeps dropping, like, where does it end? Who didn't they copy from? And is anything actually original? It blows your mind. I love being free. I love the peace of knowing now where this came from, the Stockholm syndrome of wondering who was my captor. And I love helping other people be able to reclaim their lives and their identity, to realize you were captive to someone who wasn't real. You did have a kidnapper, and it was someone in your own mind that your parents and pastor teachers taught you to think was real, and he wasn't ever there. What a beautiful, beautiful thing. Thank you to my supporters. Again, thank you for your questions. I apologize I couldn't get them in the interview. I desperately wanted to, just wasn't enough time. I sacrificed many of my own questions, but this is a starting point. Hopefully Philip Yancey and I will speak again at some point. I don't know, maybe this afterward, if he does watch it, will be a bad taste in his mouth. I hope not, but I have to speak freely as he does in his books. I have to speak freely on my channel. And this is my heart. My heart is for freedom. My heart is for the truth. My heart is for setting the captives free. My heart is for the truth that does set people free, the truth that Christianity is mythology. But I love you all. Appreciate your support. I've gotten so many messages, even in the last week. People just absolutely so glad for what I'm doing. So that people have my back, and people that believe in me personally, and certainly believe in this channel and what it's doing, and others like it. We need your help. I know some of you support me financially, and I appreciate that a lot, for sure. And many, many more of you to support, and in terms of good messages and encouragement. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for what you're doing to keep this thing going. There's a lot of good things coming soon. We have some really cool interviews coming up, and I'm just excited. So thank you again for your support. Thank you for watching the Philip Yancey interview. Thank you for sticking with me long enough to watch this afterward. I hope it's been helpful on some level, and I look forward to the next time. Thanks again. See you soon.